Today, we will continue talking about international trade, but from the perspective of job outsourcing. I am in the United States, and here, when people talk about international trade, they immediately think jobs from the US moving to other countries. Moreover, when we think job outsourcing, most people think about factory jobs. Most people think about blue collar jobs, accountants, finance experts, marketing, social media, services. Those tend to stay in the United States, at least in the mind of Americans. So when they think about job outsourcing or international trade for that matter, they think about, for example, car manufacturing used to be in the United States. Now many people think that it's in Mexico. Clothing, shoes used to be made in the United States. Now we buy that stuff from China. Smartphones, electronics used to be made in the United States. Now we buy it primarily from Asia. So that's the kind of image people have about job outsourcing. And I will try to look at those phenomena and describe them with some statistics, but also with some economic theory, so that we can together not make up our mind, but better understand what's really going on. And then I would like to start with a couple of reasonable questions that everyone should ask. And those are, what are the gains and losses of job outsourcing? And it's important to recognize that there are both losses, which people hear about a lot, but also there are gains. But then also another equally important question is, who wins and who loses? And again, we hear a lot about the losers or people who lost something due to job outsourcing. But we never think, or usually do not think about the winners. So who wins when jobs go overseas? So let's talk about those things now. And I would like to start with some statistics. Again, because we will be talking about job outsourcing as it's seen by an average, let's say, American, although the sentiment is similar in other countries, definitely in Europe, definitely in many developed Asian countries, but also all around the world. So people think about sort of manufacturing jobs. So let me show you some statistics here so you can better assess where we stand before we get into all of the details. So this chart here shows you the changes in manufacturing in the United States measured in percent manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. So how much it accounts for in the total GDP of the United States. But then also in terms of the total dollars. So basically the value of manufactured goods adjusted for inflation. So when we look here at the manufacturing as percentage of GDP, it seems like it's been shrinking. So it went down from about 16% to about 10%, and it looks like it lost about a third of its value. So it almost seems like manufacturing has shrunk by about 30%. But when you look at the value of manufactured goods, you see that it almost doubled from under $1,400 billion to over $2,400 billion. So we see a simultaneous increase in what we make. So we make more and more, but it accounts for less and less in the total GDP, obviously because services and other parts of GDP have been growing faster. So manufacturing is losing its weight, but it's gaining the total volume. Now let's take a look at another chart. And so this one shows the relationship between employment in manufacturing and output of manufacturing. So basically how much is made. So the red line here shows how many people work in manufacturing. So if we go all the way back about 25 years to the year 1997, as you can see, we had approximately 17.5 million people working in manufacturing. The numbers started dropping pretty sharply right around year 2000 and dropped all the way to about 12 million people working in manufacturing in the year 2010. So right around post 2008 recession. Lately, we saw some increase in the number of people working in manufacturing. And so the number went up to almost 13 million people We saw a drop of about 2 million people around pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and now we are back at about 13 million people working in manufacturing. As you can see, the output has been also kind of mirroring that same trend, although notably, I don't have the numbers going all the way back to the 60s here, but if we look at the year 2005 and since then, so we see actually a steady increase. There was a drop during the 2008 recession. There was another drop during the 2020 COVID pandemic. But overall, the value of manufactured goods has been growing steadily since then. So in a way, we do see a rebound of manufacturing in the United States, at least in the last 10, 15 years. Here is another look at manufacturing versus employment. So the red line on the top of the chart shows you the so-called labor force participation rate. And the lower blue line shows you unemployment. And as you can see, the unemployment in the United States has been more or less steady over the last 75 years. In some years, it would go up to about 7, 8, 10%. In some, it would drop to about 3, 4% as it is now. But the number of people working in the United States was about 60% in the 50s. It went up to about 65% in the 90s. It dropped a little bit and then went up. So we're now at about 62 or so percent of all the US population working. And then the green line shows you the total factory productivity. So basically it shows you the productivity in the United States. And as you can see, while employment, so total number of people working, unemployment, total number of people not working, and productivity, so employment and unemployment have been more or less stable, whereas productivity has been growing dramatically. And so it's an index. So if we take 1955 as the base, so the productivity has increased dramatically since then. And as you can see, productivity has been increasing while employment stayed more or less the same. And we'll need to remember and come back to this chart a little bit later. So, but before we do get into unemployment and manufacturing and job outsourcing, here is an exercise that I play with my students when I teach this class in class. So I ask my students a few questions that I would like to ask you. And so let's see if you know the answers, because it's critically important to see whether or not you know the answers before we talk about everything else. So imagine that you have a magic wand and you can control what percentage of, I'm trying to find a magic wand here, so magic wand, and you can control what percentage of spending of American consumers goes for American-made goods, for foreign-made goods, and for Chinese-made goods. And the reason I'm picking on China here is because when we talk about job outsourcing, at least lately, people immediately think about jobs going to China. So therefore, I have a separate question here specifically about China. So for every dollar that Americans spend in the United States, in your opinion, if you had a magic wand and you could control it, in your opinion, what percentage of this dollar should go for or should be used to pay for American-made goods? What percentage of this dollar should be paid for goods made overseas in all of the other countries and specifically in the United States? So, I mean, obviously, most people, even the most hardcore patriots, they probably would agree that at least some money could be spent for foreign goods, right? You wouldn't want to have exclusively American goods, and you wouldn't never, ever buy, I don't know, Japanese cars or German cars or Italian wine or French wine, right? So what percentage should be American versus international? And of that, how much should be, when we talk about international, how much should be Chinese made? I'll tell you what my students usually say, and you compare it if this is similar to what you said. So most of my students would say that, yeah, probably 50-50 American international. It would be nice if Americans spent half of their money on American-made goods and about 50% on foreign-made goods. And then what percentage should go to China? People say, well, maybe 20% to China, 30% to other countries, and then 50 should stay in the United States. Some patriotic individuals would say, okay, well, we want to keep in the United States 60%, maybe even 65. And so 40 or 35 would need to go overseas. And they don't like, for example, China at all. So they would say, and China should get no more than 10%. So that's what I usually hear when I talk about it. Then I ask my students, what do you think really is happening? What percent really is going to China? What percent really going to other countries? And what percent of every dollar really stays in the United States? Think about that. So my students normally believe that about 30%, 25% stays in the United States. About 75% of every dollar that we spend goes overseas. And of that money that goes overseas, a good half goes to China. So they would think that about 30% goes to China, about 30% goes to other countries, and maybe 30% stays in the United States. Now, the questions I ask you come from an actual study. So the researchers actually looked at the real numbers, and then they also asked people what they think. And so here are the real numbers for you. So the truth is that of all the money spent in the United States by American consumers, 88.5% is spent on American-made goods, and only 11.5% is spent on goods made outside of the United States. Although of the foreign-made goods, only 7.3 are actual imports. The rest of the money goes to transportation costs, logistics, and things like that. So much of that actually, even though it's not spent in the United States, but it's not really paying for foreign products, it's for moving those products into the United States. And to China, of every dollar that we spend, only 2.7% goes to China. So it's like 2.7 cents. So 99.3% doesn't go to China. 97.3% doesn't go to China. 2.7 goes to China. And again, China actually gets out of that 1.9 cents because, again, the rest is lost due to transportation and some other services. So think about that. People have very strong opinions about international trade, about job outsourcing, about how much should go overseas and how much should stay in the United States. And that's, for a good reason. This is an important question. But if I gave them a magic wand and they got what they wished, they would wave the magic wand and they would get exactly what they wish. They normally would increase the portion of American money going to China tenfold, like 10 times as much as we actually spend. And to other countries, at least 3, 4, 5 times more, depending on whom you ask. So the situation is much, much better than people imagine it is. In fact, it's much, much better than people wish it was. So if you think that more money should stay in your own country for the products made domestically and less money should go overseas. So it's very tricky here because I don't trust the electorate, the people, because people have no clue. And studies show that. When asked to assess what's going on, they get it extremely wrong, very wrong. And if you give them the magic wand, they will make it much, much worse than it is. So very, very kind of dangerous situation here because people have strong opinions and they have no clue what they're talking about. Now, when we talk about international trade, most of the people or there are two main competing opinions or views on it. Some people think about job outsourcing as, well, it's a good thing. Job outsourcing means cheaper goods, and cheaper goods mean we can buy more of the stuff. Moreover, the cheaper the goods are, the more money I save, so I can spend that money on other products and services maybe made domestically. So job outsourcing is good because it helps us consume more or makes us able to consume more. The opposing view is that job outsourcing is bad because basically made in China or made in Mexico or made in other countries means not made here. So they see job outsourcing as a bad thing because job outsourcing creates jobs over there and not over here. And so they see that as a problem. So they see job outsourcing as a problem. So black and white. Obviously, it's much more complicated. Not only it's a continuum, so it's not black and white. There are many shades of gray, so it's a spectrum. But also it could be very black, very bad for some. It could be very white, very positive for others. So in these cases, it's not just bad or good. It could be good for some, bad for others, and it could be in between for some other people. So let me show you here a video that many people, or a sample video of the kind of videos that many people are educated about international trade and job outsourcing. So it's a political ad used to defame, or I guess, smear the reputation of Dick DeVos, who was one of the candidates to Congress in Michigan some time ago. And this is what that video looked like. So watch it. You probably have seen videos like this yourself. So here is the video.
The truth about Dick DeVos and China? September 6th, finally, Dick DeVos admitted he cut Michigan jobs and created jobs in China. Fact, as president of Amway, he laid off nearly 1,400 Michigan workers. Fact, he invested $200 million in China. Fact, he built a factory there and created thousands of jobs for China. Is that what Michigan needs? Dick DeVos, the more you know, the worse it gets.
So it's a very scary type of video. The voice is grim. The picture is grim. The statistics are grim. So even though the purpose of the video is to reduce the chances of Dick DeVos being elected to Congress, but at the same time, many people use this or get this kind of information and they make the conclusion that job outsourcing to China is bad because I've heard something about that and it didn't sound good. So outsourcing must be bad. Here is another video that sort of shows the other side of job outsourcing. So let me show you this video here and then we'll talk about it. So this one is from the movie called Outsourced, a wonderful movie about a guy from the United States sent to India to open a call center there. And then the boss comes, visits them. And so here is the scene where they listen to the phone calls of their employees. And so the employees handle some online sales. And so here is the video.
Hello?
You gotta be kidding me. I'm buying a freaking American Eagle from a company that is supposed to be in America, and I get India?
I understand that you're upset, sir.
No, you don't. You don't understand. Last month, I lost my job at the plant where I worked for 22 years because the whole operation moved to Mexico. My brother had to leave town because there are no jobs.
I know how you feel, sir.
No, you don't. You have a job.
Sir, please don't hang up. I have a solution for you.
What?
See, we understand that many Americans are upset about outsourcing, so we have located American-made versions of all our products. If you have a pen, I will give you the website of an American company that makes an eagle statue very similar to ours. Same size, same materials, only theirs is made 100% in America.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, but is the price about the same?
No, sir. Theirs is $212 more. Sir?
Yeah, all right. Just some of yours.
Thank you, sir. May I have your credit card number?
So as you can see here, we are all for American-made goods until it comes to counting this. And all of a sudden, then we think about our own interest. Is it in my interest to pay more or to pay less? How much more am I willing to pay for an American-made product? And is it good for me when I save money on, in this case, apparently an Indian-made or foreign-made product? So that's a good question to ask. Now, when we talk about job outsourcing, many people think about outsourcing of jobs from high labor cost countries to low labor cost countries, right? So for example, here in the United States, nobody complains about job outsourcing to, for example, Germany or Japan or Norway. Most people complain about job outsourcing to Mexico or China, presumably because it's not unfair competition. Because in the United States, wages are high, and greedy entrepreneurs, business owners ship jobs to Mexico or China where labor is cheaper. And so they're trying to save a quick buck on American hardworking workers. And so they outsource those jobs to where the jobs are cheaper. And so to illustrate that it's not an entirely correct way to think about it, I show my students, or I give my students this example, this activity. So this example is based on a movie, Shallow Hell. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's from the 90s or maybe early 2000s. And in that movie, there is a scene where Tony Robbins gets stuck with Hal in the elevator. Hal is the character in the movie played by Jack Black. And so he hypnotizes the main character into him seeing only the inner beauty of women. Now, that's not related to our story about job outsourcing here. So, but imagine that Tony Robbins can hypnotize people into whatever, beliefs or actions he wants them to. And so let's imagine that he looks around, he sees a lot of students, he sees a lot of business people, and he thinks, well, they probably need more electronics, computers and phones. And so he thinks, well, what I can do here is maybe I can hypnotize almost 1 million employees of Foxconn. So that's a company in China that makes Apple products, iPhones, iPads, Apple Watches, MacBook Pros, and whatever else. And so he thinks, well, maybe those electronics will help Americans to be more productive. And so he directs his energy towards China, towards Foxconn, and the trick works. And imagine in this hypothetical scenario, the Chinese workers fall in love with the United States so much that they decide to make all those Apple products for free for the United States. And so next day in the morning, they come to work, they make 1 million iPhones, 1 million iPads, 1 million Apple computers, and they ship all of that stuff for free to the United States. And so I would ask my students, is it good for America? Would it be good for America if we received thousands and thousands or millions of units of Apple products made by Chinese workers in China, Foxconn, for free? What would you say? Would it be good for America or bad for America? Now, when I ask that question of my students, almost all of them say, yeah, it would be good. I can use an Apple computer. I can use an Apple phone. That would save me, what, about $1,000, maybe even more today, right? So first, I can use that money to buy something else. Maybe I'll go and get a haircut. Maybe I'll, renovate my kitchen. Maybe I'll buy, I don't know, some other services, fix my car, for example. Yeah, it would be good. There is always one smarty pants who says, well, that would be bad because it would make us lazy. But most people say, yeah, that would be fine. Now, I continue with this game and I say, well, imagine that a month has passed and the hypnosis becomes starts fading. And so those Foxconn employees say, well, we love America very much still and we would like to help them. But maybe we shouldn't sell those computers, ship those computers for free. How about we're going to charge 1 cent per iPhone? So almost free, but we will charge 1 cent. Is it still good for America or bad for America? Again, most of my students say, well, yeah, 1 cent for iPhone, 1 cent for Apple computer, MacBook Pro Air, whatever the latest name is. Sure, it would be good. Then the hypnosis wears down a little bit more and they start charging 10 cents. And then they charge $1. And then they charge $10. And I ask my students, is that still good? So when it's $1 per computer, is it still good? And they say, yeah, it's fine. How about $10? And they say, well, it's still fine. How about $100? They say, yeah, that would be still beneficial for the United States. How about $1,000? And that's when my students are thinking, $1,000? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's not such a good idea. I say, how about $5,000? And that's when everybody says, no, that's bad. We don't want that. We don't want that, forget about it. Now, the point of this exercise is that the activity here, if you don't think about it as job outsourcing, if you think about it getting products from overseas for free or for cheap, people have no problems with that. People have absolutely no problem with that. They find it beneficial. But then you flip the narrative and you call it job outsourcing, you call it imports. And all of a sudden, people start complaining about cheap imports. Nobody complains here about German cars like Mercedes, BMW, Audi. Nobody complains here about maybe some expensive like Lexus, for example, or Infiniti from Japan. People complain about products from low-skill labor or low-cost labor countries. And so that's the paradox. When you think about it purely from the point of view of products and prices, everybody's fine. When you think about it from the point of view of international trade, all of a sudden we stop thinking here and we start thinking here. We get emotional and we get very negative. Now, here is an interesting story too. So very interesting story that sort of struck me and I still don't know how to answer it. So let me tell you what happened and then I will ask you what you think about it. So some years ago, so about 10 years ago, there was this interesting case happening. The IRS was auditing a guy who worked as a programmer in San Jose, in California. And so they got surprised because the guy worked for like 5 different companies full time. And they were like, how can it be? I mean, how can a guy work for 5 companies at the same time? And so the guy made something like $500,000 a year. So that was at the time when programmers were making about $100,000 a year. So he was 5 full-time jobs, was making about $500,000. And they were like, how can he have a full-time job at 5 different companies? Something's not right. And so they started investigating. And so what they found was that the guy had full-time jobs at 5 companies, but he didn't actually do the work. So he would get the order, he would be told what needs to be done, and he was one of those remote workers. And then he would simply outsource his job to people in India. So basically, his own pay would be about $100,000. He hired 5 people in India or more for about $25,000 each. And so he would get his own order from the boss or, from the manager, and then simply forwards it to India and asks people to do his work for him, pays them about a quarter of what he's paid in the United States, and then submits their work as his own. And that's basically how he made that money. So the question becomes, is it good? Is it bad? Is it fair? Is it not? What's your opinion here? So again, when I ask this question of my students, most of them get uneasy with this. So they're like, yeah, he was cheating. But then I would kind of play the devil's advocate here and I would say, well, how was he cheating? I mean, he had a contract that you do this and this is how much you will be paid. So he did deliver the product, the code, I guess, in his case, and he was paid exactly what he negotiated. The quality was good. It was made on time. The boss received what the boss paid for. So how is that cheating? And so people are like, yeah, but I still don't know. And then again, I sort of keep playing the devil's advocate and I say, well, would you prefer that he did it himself? I mean, the guy in a way is a patriot. So he kept 5 good paying jobs in the United States. Because if the company did that, right, if the company outsourced the jobs to China or to India, that would be job outsourcing bona fide. So that would be to low labor countries. Here, in a way, the money stays in the United States, or at least most of it stays. And so that's where it gets a little tricky. And so here I have a collection of articles. Actually, he was not the only guy, so there were other people. So there were people caught outsourcing their own jobs to China. There was this very interesting article by the Insider where they said it's actually happening a lot. And so they call those people fraudsters. But again, I mean, is it really fraud? I guess it could be because maybe there is some issues of data safety, maybe copyright. When I hire you, I assume that you don't show what you do to others. So whereas this guy does. But you see how tricky this is. I mean, is it bad? Is it good? Is the guy a patriot who kept high-paying jobs in the United States? Or is he a fraudster who outsourced his own job? Not sure how to answer it, but that kind of displays the absurdity of the situation. Now imagine the companies cut him out and outsourced the jobs to India directly. Would it be better than when the guy outsourced the job? So who wins, who loses? Would it be better for the consumers? Would it be better for the business owners? Would it be better for American employees? Tricky question. Now, when people talk about job outsourcing, they immediately think that job outsourcing costs American jobs. So they think that when jobs go overseas, or in other words, when Americans buy more from overseas, so when imports grow, people think that means that unemployment grows. So the more we buy overseas, the fewer jobs we have in the United States. Admit it, that's what you think too now, right? You probably think the more imports come into the country, the fewer jobs are left in the country. So the more people are unemployed. Well, here are some statistics. Here on this chart, I plotted imports in billions of dollars. And so that's the scale on the left, blue line, and unemployment. So that's the red line and the scale on the right. So as you can see, if you know anything about statistics, this is a complete zero correlation. So the correlation would be positive if both lines went up or down or up and down together. It would be negative if they went like this, when one goes up, the other one goes down. But that's not what we see. We see one line more or less stable, fluctuating between like 4 and 8%, more or less. And the other one is steady growth. So imports have increased from 1950. I mean, we're talking about like 1,000 times, like literally 1,000 times. Not just, the scales up, one is percentage and one is billions of dollars. It's hard to compare. But look at it, like in 1970, even less than that. So imports were what, like, not even a billion, probably a few billion, like a billion or maybe a few little billion, so to speak, right? And now it's four billion dollars. I mean, like these are gigantic $4,000 billion. These are gigantic numbers. So it increased literally thousands of times, whereas unemployment hasn't really changed that much. And so, in fact, when you look at the chart, it seems like there were times when they had negative correlation. So, for example, in the 2000s, imports went up and unemployment went down. And then the other way around. So when the recession hit, the unemployment went up and imports went down. Then again, the same thing in the mid 2000s and late 2000s. Imports are growing like crazy and unemployment is going down. And then boom, unemployment goes down and imports go up, right? So same thing here. So the teens, the tens. So again, during this time, imports were growing. So more and more imported goods and lower unemployment. And then COVID strikes. And so we see the reverse trend. Nobody buys, or imports went down dramatically, but imports went down and then unemployment went up and then they reversed the course. So all indicates that the correlation is basically zero over time if you look at it over decades. But in that short period of times when they kind of move together, they actually move in the opposite directions. I mean, obviously, it doesn't mean that we need to sharply increase imports to lower unemployment. That's not what's happening. So what we actually have is that there is a third factor that affects both of these factors. So what happens is that when economy is good, that's when unemployment is low and we buy more, including more imported goods. And when things get bad, like, for example, a recession or a pandemic, we see an increase in unemployment, but we also see, we buy fewer goods from overseas. But again, the two are not related in any way. That's because, both of them depend on the state of the economy in the moment. But over time, no, that wouldn't be the reason. So imports do not correlate with unemployment. In fact, when you look at people who lose their jobs, literally less, only about 0.1%, like 1 in 1,000, actually gets fired or laid off because his or her job was actually outsourced overseas. And when we talk about job elimination in general, not people just being laid off, but, like jobs eliminated, not somebody else is being hired, but jobs eliminated, again, only about 1% of the jobs that are eliminated actually go overseas. Most of the jobs that are being eliminated, it just simply didn't work. Consumers didn't want the product. The manager couldn't organize the business. The company couldn't secure financing, whatever the reasons. But most of the companies do not take the jobs and move them overseas when they close down. They close down for all kinds of reasons. A very, very small percentage of jobs actually lost is due to outsourcing. So people often get it pretty wrong. Now, here is a real reason why we see a decrease in manufacturing while at the same time an increase in manufacturing production. So why we see a decrease in the number of jobs in manufacturing, but an increase in manufacturing production. Here is the real reason. I'll show you. So when people blame a reduction in the manufacturing jobs on job outsourcing, most of that blame is unsubstantiated. Most of the jobs lost in manufacturing are not due to outsourcing. Some are, but the vast majority are not. The vast majority of the jobs lost in manufacturing is due to automation. So it's not Mexicans who replace Americans, it's robots who replace Americans. And the same thing is happening in China, for example, now. So many Chinese manufacturing workers are losing their jobs to robots, not to outsourcing. And that's why we see more and more production. So American factories make more and more goods, but with fewer and fewer people because people are being replaced by robots. Anyway, here is a question that is likely to appear in the exam if you are my student. Let's see if you can answer it. So the statistics on the previous slide, and I show you the picture here at the bottom of the slide. What does it show you? What is the correct answer? And the correct answer is that yes, the correlation between imports and unemployment is effectively zero. The two do not correlate. So another way to think about it is, or another important thing to think about is when we talk about job outsourcing is, well, again, I'm using here the American context. So for my international students, or those who may be from other countries listening to this lecture, I suppose the sentiment may be similar in your country too. But in the United States, usually this discussion revolves around, let's protect American workers. Let's protect Americans. So job outsourcing, that's bad for Americans, and jobs in America is good for Americans. But the question I would like to ask here is, what is America? Or what constitutes America? So many people, when they think about job outsourcing, they think about blue-collar American workers, so people at American factories. But they, as you just saw on the slides, it's only like 10%, 13% of the employment in the United States. 90, 85% of people in the United States don't work in that sector. And so when we are trying to protect American manufacturing jobs, the question is, are we helping all Americans or are we helping a specific segment of Americans? And so Americans are also engineers. Americans are also entrepreneurs. Americans are also marketing specialists, logistics specialists. How about them? So if I, for example, start my own business and I start buying products in China, manufactured in China, and sell somewhere else in the United States or elsewhere, I am an American citizen. So am I not entitled to some pursuit of happiness by making money on outsourcing? Is that really bad? I'm looking here at some companies, like, for example, the worst outsourcers out there. Apple, again, when you buy an iPhone, I'm not sure if you know, but if you look at what it says on that phone, it says designed in California. And the reason for that is because it's actually made in China. So Apple products are assembled, made in China. So designed in the United States, but made in China. Nike, for that matter, too. So when you buy Nike shoes, Nike never manufactured shoes in the United States. It's one of the greatest American companies, but pretty much all of their products are made overseas. They began from making them, buying them from first Japan, and then from China, and then from other countries as well. Dell, HP, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, all of these big American brands, they outsource a lot of jobs, or they make a lot of products under their brand overseas. So the owners of those companies, and all of them are publicly traded companies, so you may own some stock in those companies as well. And if so, you are a co-owner of those companies. So is that bad? Like, for example, I do have some stock of Apple. So does it make me a trader because Apple assembles their products overseas? I have, for example, a Dell computer here. It was made in China. So was that wrong of me to buy it? So as a consumer, as an entrepreneur, as a designer, as a marketing specialist, as a logistics specialist, so when I buy products or when I make money on products that were made out overseas, am I betraying my country, or am I just being frugal? Am I just being entrepreneurial? So again, if you believe in what Adam Smith said, then yeah, trade is good. And I found a way to make some money in the pursuit of my own profits. I make everyone better. Isn't that the philosophy behind the Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith, free market capitalism? That's the whole idea. Now, also don't forget, when you look at some companies here, I give you the examples of Apple and General Motors. So Apple, one of the greatest American IT companies, and IT companies that makes also hardware. And General Motors is the largest American auto manufacturer. Well, look at what percentage of products they sell overseas. So Apple consistently sells about 60 up to 70% of their products overseas. So Apple's revenue from overseas is about 60 to 70%. Only 30 to 40% of Apple's profits or revenue comes from the United States. You look at General Motors, same thing. So sales by country. They sell more cars in China than they do in the United States. And then they also sell a lot of their cars in Brazil, in Canada, in Mexico, and some other parts of the world. So would Apple be what they are if they had to make their products only in the United States? General Motors be what they are if they had to make their cars, trucks, vehicles only in the United States? I mean, yes, they make a lot of those products overseas, but they sell a lot of those products overseas too. If they had to make them in the United States, they would be much more expensive. They probably would not be as affordable to us. If you have an iPhone, would you be willing to pay more for it if it were made in the United States? How much more? So if, let's say, an average price of an iPhone is $1,000, would you pay $1,100 for this phone to be made in the United States? How about $1,200, $1,500? I don't know how much would it cost if it were made in the United States, but definitely much more. So you as a consumer, would you be happier about that? Same thing with General Motors. So anyway, think about that also when you criticize job outsourcing, because America is not all manufacturing jobs. It's never been. Manufacturing has always been less than half, and in fact, much less than half. At some time, it was close to a third. Now it's close to, as I said, 12, 15%, depending on the year. But yeah, so I mean, manufacturing jobs are not all of America. Now, here is another look at the picture. And so here is some statistics about what or how much an average employee at different companies generates. So there was a time when the highest profit per employee or the highest revenue per employee was in oil and gas. Then, so it was like in the 70s. Then for a while in the 80s and 90s or early 90s, the highest profits generated per employee were in finance sector, in banking. And now when you look at the picture here, so the highest paid or the highest value generated by an employee is at Apple. So an Apple employee generates about $2 million in revenue and about $400,000 in profits. So every person who works at Apple, on average, generates about $400,000 in profits and about $2 million in revenue. And these are outdated figures, so that's a little bit, old. So by now it can be even more than that. Now, how can Apple generate so much money per employee? Apple has 124,000 employees currently, people who actually work for Apple in the United States. I'm not sure if it's global employment or only in the United States, but surely a good portion of those employees are in the United States. Well, one of the reasons they can make so much money per employee is because they outsource less profitable functions, like, for example, the actual assembly of the product. So they design it, they code it, they manage the marketing, they manage the logistics, the finance, but they outsource the parts that are not very profitable. Now, would it be better for Apple if Apple had to have all its labor force, all of the production in the United States? Obviously not. But would America be better off if Apple was only in the United States? Well, again, if you believe in free market and capitalism and Adam Smith's philosophy, again, it is through the pursuit of our own benefits, of our own profits, individual interests, we benefit the whole society. So here we can see that, I don't know, I mean, these are pretty good figures. So Apple, Nike, all of those companies that outsource what's not profitable and keep what's profitable, they make gigantic profits in the United States. Would it be better if they had to stitch every shoe? I don't know, but that's something to think about. Now, by the way, if you now hate me because all of this sounds too liberal, too unpatriotic, I will be talking about the problems related to job outsourcing. I will be talking about why it's important to bring jobs back to the United States, but later. So for now, I would like to show you one side of the story that many people often don't see. Now, going back to examples. So if job outsourcing is so good, and so far I've been talking about primarily the positives of it, how come we never hear about the positives? How come we hear only about the negatives? So why do we see so many protests against, for example, NAFTA, North American Trade Agreement, the free trade zone between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, now called the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement, right? So, or for example, why do we hear about so many protests about the European Union in Europe, Brexits and all that dissatisfaction? So why nobody is celebrating the trade, international trade and free trade zones? Well, the truth is that it could be also psychological. Not only people usually do not have enough information to properly assess the situation. As I showed you at the beginning of this lecture, many people have no idea how much money they actually spend on foreign-made goods compared to how much money they spend on domestic goods. So many people have no idea. They don't realize that most of the money they spend on domestic goods, like for example in the United States, food is primarily domestic, housing is primarily domestic, transportation is primarily domestic, banking, all kinds of things is primarily domestic. So most of the money we spend is on goods made in the country. So people protest against things that they don't understand or maybe they misunderstand. But also it's psychology. So losses loom much larger than gains. And so if I save money on cheaper foreign-made goods, I'm not going to go to the street. I'm not even going to notice that. Or if I do notice that it's cheaper, for example, it's not something that I will brag about, so to speak. I don't really care that much. I'm happy, but I don't really care. But when I lose something, like if I lose my job, if I all of a sudden, I had a gainful employment and now my job went overseas, that's where I'm going to take to the streets. And so even though people on the streets represent a tiny portion of the population, but to them, it's a real loss. If I lost my job, if, my job went overseas, I probably would be so unhappy that I would also take to the street. But when you look, for example, at this picture, so it's easy to see a person, or it's common to see a person on the street saying that NAFTA kills jobs. But for example, General Motors makes many of its cars and trucks and vehicles overseas, in Mexico particularly. And so, for example, Mexican-made Chevy Silverado, it's a big pickup truck made by GM. So the difference in cost because of that is about $15,000 now. And so people buy that truck, they pay less for it because it was made overseas. GM was able to lower the cost by importing many of the components and assembling the truck in Mexico where labor is cheaper. But you will not see anyone on the street saying, I saved $15,000 on my Mexican-made Chevy Silverado, right? So you wouldn't see that. In fact, if he did it, first he would be endangering his life probably, or at least, many people will not be happy with his sort of display of, savings due to job outsourcing. But also people just wouldn't go on the street because they saved money. They would go on the street because they lost jobs. And so that's one of the reasons, or one main reason, why we don't really hear much about the positives, even though the person saving $15,000 on a truck or whatever the savings are, it's an important benefit for the United States. So if he saves that much money, he can now maybe buy a new truck. And if he's a contractor, he can be more productive with the new truck. He can save that money and spend it on something else, buy some other tools, hire additional workers, offer his services for less. Or take a vacation, don't need to work that much. So all of those are very, very important benefits for the United States, but we don't think about them. So, and that's why, one of the reasons we hear only about the negatives and not positives, right? Now, when would it be then beneficial or justifiable to impose taxes on imports? When would it be justifiable to restrict imports? Think about that. So we discussed that it may not be as bad as many people think, but maybe sometimes it is. And so the question is when imports are bad and when it would be justifiable, when would it be right, beneficial for the government to maybe impose import tariffs on imports so that we can limit them and protect American workers or whatever country you come from. Well, so here are some of the examples where such policies might be justified, at least in short term. So one, support of infant industries, nascent industries, new industries. So for example, China did that a lot when they were trying to develop their own capacity in some industries. Manufacturing first and foremost, for example, AC, refrigerators. So they literally had specifically for that import tariffs and other barriers so that Chinese new companies in China making that same product had it a little easier to develop competitive abilities so that they are able then to compete with imports and foreign competition. And so, yes, if your country is trying to develop a new industry, whatever that might be, it might be totally justifiable to protect them for a time being, maybe for a year, maybe for 5 years, maybe even for 10 years. But at some point, I guess you need to let it go because, and we will have a separate lecture on that, if you protect your own industry too much, if they shield it from competition, they tend to become lazy, uninnovative, and basically not competitive. So competition is good, but in the early stages, when other countries have the capacity, it would be very difficult for nascent industries, for new companies, new industries to become competitive, and it might be justifiable to protect them for a while. Another good example would be when companies or industries are going through restructuring. Again, in 2008, the automotive industry in the United States was basically bankrupt. So GM, General Motors, and Ford, and Chrysler, they filed for bankruptcy and basically were not competitive. Ford was very close to going bankrupt, but they didn't declare bankruptcy. They were able to survive this through this period. And so, yes, during that time, the U.S. government was trying to protect American automotive industry as much as they could. So, in fact, not only through the import tariffs, but also I remember at that time, Toyota had this story with runaway Toyotas, apparently some problem with brakes. And so it was later proven that it was not true. There was nothing wrong with Toyotas. But it seemed like the government was using that opportunity to sort of suppress Japanese cars a little bit in favor of American cars. And it did work. So it did work. So Ford didn't go through bankruptcy, but they were in dire situation. They improved. GM, Chrysler did much better, and they are all doing pretty well now. So was it because of that protectionism? Well, definitely in part, at least in part, due to that protectionism. Tesla also borrowed some money from the U.S. government at a discounted rate, interest rate, and so again they repaid it all back. So that was, but so that protectionism during those tough times actually helped a lot. And some people say that maybe it would be justifiable if you want to exert temporary pressure to negotiate better deals. So if you think that other countries are taking advantage of your country, sometimes some people think that it may be justifiable to impose barriers, import tariffs or erect some other barriers to foreign goods so that your own manufacturing would be protected a little bit for a while. So Obviously, you don't want to overdo it because we know that protectionism in in a long term makes your companies less competitive, but it might be justifiable in the short term. Now, here is a video that I want to show you that dates back to, I think this was from 2014, when Donald Trump was only considering to run for the US president. And so here is his interview with, at that time, a very influential, probably the most influential commentator and TV personality, Bill O'Reilly. So again, those of you who are older obviously remember all of that. Those who are younger, I'm just giving you the context. So that's the guy whose job was taken later by Tucker Carlson. So if you know Tucker Carlson, so Bill O'Reilly was basically Tucker Carlson before him. And so here is a question that he asks of Donald Trump, at that time not even a candidate. So what he's going to do about China, Chinese imports.
The top story tonight, Donald Trump for president, looks like he might run. New Harris Internet poll out today says 10% of Americans would vote for Mr. Trump, and that ties him with Mitt Romney in the lead for the Republican sweepstakes. But is Donald Trump really up to the job? Here we go. All right, let's start with the big issue in the 2012 presidential race, jobs. Why haven't jobs come back as fast as many people thought they should?
Because they're going to China. China is taking our jobs. They're making our product. And we have to do something about it, and we have to do something about it quickly. They are decimating our country just as OPEC is decimating our country with their oil prices.
But how can you compete with Chinese labor, which is much, much less than unionized American labor? I mean, what are you going to make a law that says American companies can't manufacture in China? You're going to make a law?
By getting China not to manipulate their currency. It's very tough for our companies to compete with Chinese companies because very simply they manipulate their currency. And when you manipulate a currency like they do, they're professionals at it.
Well, how are you going to do that, though? Chinese are going to say, we're going to do what we want, and we don't
do
care what
something
you do.
very simple, Bill. 25% tax on China unless they behave.
So 25% on China unless they behave. So import tariff essentially, right? What's interesting, Donald Trump did become president eventually, not in that cycle, but eventually he did become the president, the 45th president of the United States. And he did exactly what he promised. He did impose an import tariff on Chinese-made goods. And so here are some of the things that we will discuss related to import tariffs and how many jobs they do save for America and at what cost. And so you don't call me or don't accuse me of being biased. I will start with Obama here. So in 2009, there was this big story with the Chinese-made tires. So China started selling tires in the United States for automobiles. And so they were cheaper. And so they cost American jobs in the tire manufacturing industry. So all of a sudden, American tire manufacturers felt the heat. And so Obama at that time didn't know what to do. So Obama imposed in 2009 an import tariff on Chinese tires. And so years passed, and economists did some research, looked at the data, and they did calculate how many jobs were saved in the American tire manufacturing industry and at what cost. And here are the figures. Here are the figures, people. So the 2009 tire tariffs cost Americans $926,000 per job saved. Plus, in addition, it led to 3 retail jobs per factory job saved. So basically, for every job that we saved with higher tariffs in manufacturing of tires, we as consumers paid almost $1 million per position. And for every factory worker we saved, we lost 3 retailer jobs. So a staggering cost. It would have been literally cheaper to give those people, I don't know, $50,000, $100,000 a year and not impose the tariffs and say, okay, here is the money, go restudy or start your own business or do whatever else you want to do. But let us buy the cheaper Chinese tires. At least that's what the numbers show. Now, yeah, so staggering numbers. Now, also during Obama era, so there were some other studies here, and so that other study here, so the U.S. Bureau of Statistics, 1.2 thousand jobs, so 1,200 jobs were saved at about $926,000 per job. And then we'll look at the numbers here, and so we see that tire jobs saved 1.2 thousand, but retail jobs lost because of that 3.5 thousand. So we as consumers paid more. We saved over 1,000 jobs in tire manufacturing or manufacturing in general, but we lost 3 times as much in retail. Good or bad? Well, you make the conclusion on your own, but I show you the numbers. Now, here is some more stuff, and again, going back to Clinton, Bush Sr., and then Trump later on. So here are the tariffs on on imported steel. Again, in the 90s, Japan became a major player in the steel industry. And so Japanese steel was cheaper and it was better quality. And so many American steel manufacturers, steel makers, started losing jobs. And so Bill Clinton at that time, so Democrat, so he decided that we need to protect those American jobs, blue-collar jobs. So let's slap an import tariff on Japanese steel. And then Bush Sr. did the same thing, now Republican, in 2002, 10 years later. Yes, let's protect American jobs. Let's impose an import tariff on foreign-made steel. And then the same thing happened with Trump. So when we looked at the numbers, we saw that because of the import tariffs on steel, because steel becoming more important, we actually lost many more jobs, including in manufacturing, than we gained. Because while a few steel workers kept their jobs, many other industries that depend on the price of steel lost their jobs. Like, for example, automotive workers. If steel is more expensive, cars are more expensive. If cars are more expensive, we buy fewer cars. If we buy fewer cars, there is a need for fewer people making cars. And so the import tariffs did save some jobs in the steel industry, but many more jobs were lost in other sectors. And so here is Trump-era studies. So those jobs that were saved due to the import tariffs cost about $900,000 per job saved. So again, the price is staggering. Now, again, we're going back to Trump's era, and so we're talking about washing machines. Again, there was the same story with the washing machines. At some point, there was this concern that the foreign-made washing machines are killing American jobs. Import tariff was imposed. And again, jobs were saved, but only a few of them, and at a staggering cost of, again, close to $1 million, $815,000. There are similar figures here, so, that goes that way. So, is job outsourcing then good? Are imports good? So we just talked about all the many benefits of job outsourcing or international trade, and we talked about how imports may not be so bad after all. So does it mean that job outsourcing is good? Well, not necessarily. So here is a little cartoon here. Obviously, no, you may not outsource your homework to India. Obviously, it's not always good. I want my kids to do their own homework. I'm sure they can find someone in another country who can do their job or homework, and now increasingly so, ChatGPT can do my kids' homework. But I don't want them to outsource their job to people in other countries, or, their homework to people in other countries, or to the AI, artificial intelligence. I want them to do it themselves because that makes them smarter, that makes them more competitive, right? Now, I'm also looking at it a little bit differently lately, looking at the events in Ukraine, at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the economic theory says that if you can buy something cheaper overseas, do so. So that's basic economics. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, free trade, right? But we found ourselves in a situation where Russian aggression in Ukraine all of a sudden exposed that many European countries, and even many, for example, the United States, Canada, countries further away, may not be prepared to defend themselves. All of a sudden, we see that the European, at least, military sector is not doing that well. It seems like many things are being bought overseas, essential things like computer chips, like manufactured goods. Many of them come, for example, from China. All of a sudden, we find ourselves dependent on those goods. And so in many ways, we find ourselves vulnerable. And so in many ways, we find that we don't have the capacity to make those products. And so the question here becomes, can we afford not to make our own defense equipment, for example? Can we afford not to have our own agriculture? Very important. So something happened to Ukraine. Russia is also under sanctions, and those two countries make a good portion of food. And so all of a sudden, the price of food is up, and many countries find themselves with a shortage of food. So can we afford to rely on other countries to provide these strategic goods? Can we afford not to have our own energy supply? Again, so Europe, especially the European Union, was very dependent on Russian oil and gas. Well, if something goes wrong, if the dictator decides to cut off the supply of gas, as Putin did repeatedly many times, trying to extort higher prices, or when the war happens like this and some of those supply lines will be broken for whatever reason, so does that put us at too much risk? So these are all very good questions. And then, yes, if we want to have weapons and machinery manufactured in our own countries, and if we want to have our own agricultural sector and energy, how much will it cost? I mean, as it will cost us more than to buy maybe those products in China or India or wherever else you buy it from. So how much more are you willing to pay for those products? And can you afford that additional cost? So these are all very important questions that many ask now, right? So now, but then again, if we don't pay the extra price, if we outsource all of those essential industries, does that impose too much risk on us? So where is that balance? Where is that balanced? Very important question. Here is, I want to show you here a video that dates again a few years back, relatively recent. And so this was when Tim Cook was asked if American jobs are ever coming back. So again, Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple. Apple makes all its products in China. And so Tim Cook was asked, would Apple ever consider making smartphones, computers, tablets in the United States? And here is what he said.
There's a confusion about China that, and let me at least give you my opinion. The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is. Like the products we do require really advanced tooling. And the precision that you have to have in tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. You know, in the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields. It's that vocational expertise is very deep, very, very deep here. And I give the education system a lot of credit for continuing to push on that even when others were de-emphasizing vocational. Now I think many countries in the world have woke up and said, you know, this is a key thing and we've got to correct that. But China called that right from the beginning.
We are talking about jobs going to China not because it's cheaper to make products there, because labor is cheaper, but because they have developed the capacity, you know, like for example, advanced manufacturing, advanced tooling that America doesn't have. Like literally, Americans do not have the capacity to make for example, the laptops that Apple needs, just because they don't have the technology, they don't have the skill, they don't have the people who are able to do it and the machines that are able to do it. China does. And so what does it mean? Does it mean that we made a mistake by not developing that capacity, by losing it? So did China get it right and we get it wrong? So maybe we did. So what does it mean? I'm going to leave you with that question here. So obviously, again, to conclude, job outsourcing, international trade offers a lot of benefits, many important benefits that many people don't see, don't realize, don't understand. So Adam Smith definitely was right when he said that international trade is good. But at the same time, it does seem like there are more sides to that story. And one of them being that, yeah, maybe we can lose something that is essential to our own security and survival. So it's important to find that balance.